practical advantages it could be described, it could also be experienced, and it could be, in a sense, fitted into the social pattern. A dream might, therefore, pertain to a world or vision or place beyond this life. A vision could be an experience of that which is beyond, a conscious contemplation. Now, of course, for a long time, dreams were considered as symbolic of mystical values. Dreams were the basis of healing in ancient Greece. Dreams were the basis of social growth among the American Indians. Dreams were always something a little beyond, a little intangible, but sufficiently substantial to be recalled, to be remembered, and to be shared with other people. Now, dreams also gave another proportion to consciousness. Dreams often were centered in some other place than the one that we are familiarly acquainted with. While we lived in our comparative modest dwellings, we had dreams of temples and palaces and shrines and great mountains, hierarchies of celestial beings, and all the mysterious mechanism of Dante's Divine Comedy. All of these things could be experienced, and we might add, to be practical, they were perhaps best experienced after reading Dante's Divine Comedy, because that type of reading placed certain attitudes or ideas in the subconscious of the human being. And gradually, as intellectualism increased and improved, the individual not only began to downgrade his dreams, but also to change them to meet the changing social conditions of his times. But dreams were a sleep phenomena that has played a part in man's evolution from the very earliest time. Now, there have always been natural mystics. These natural mystics were not necessarily psychics. They had experiences, but these experiences were inward revelations. The true mystic was not telling his neighbor what was going to happen to him. The true mystic was exploring a realm or a vista far greater than the material world in which he lived. Perhaps among the great mystics we should mention Johann Tauler, Jacob Boehme, and Emanuel Swedenborg. These persons came from different areas of life, different levels of culture, but also had similar experiences. Swedenborg was a scientist of high standing, and Boehme was a shoemaker, and Tauler was a monk. These different people all had mystical experiences, and these experiences resulted largely from a great longing or a great yearning, or, as in the case of several of them, a great tragedy in their personal lives. There came a time, and is always a time, when an individual who becomes sorry for himself, perhaps quite legitimately, not simply an emotional state of affairs, but a frustration of the real values of living. The individuals of this type may retire into themselves and live in a world of constructive and idealistic fantasies. But are they fantasies? This is also a question that has never been satisfactorily solved to meet everyone's requirements. But we also know that the mind has become a powerful factor in the effort to make the invisible real to us. And the mind has developed all kinds of experimental processes. The mind has borrowed heavily from outside sources for the information intended to reform the inner life of the person to whom that mind belonged. So the mind almost always builds an invisible upon the visible through a certain intellectual, mental approach. And today we have all kinds of such approaches. They are found in practically every religious system of the world, and they are opposed by every agnostic system. They have become the basis of moral philosophy and have also resulted, unfortunately, in the rise of a great many competitive institutions. But the mind, becoming more and more enmeshed in the obvious or the external, and the external becoming less and less soundly founded, so that it is based today very heavily upon mistakes and misfortunes. The mind becomes a dangerous instrument. Now, the mind was not such a dangerous instrument long ago, when society was a comparatively simple structure. Probably, really, the mind's domination of the situation began with the dawn of ambition. And when ambition reached a certain degree where it was willing to accomplish its end by destructive means, then ambition became a mental liability. And we have several such liabilities today, in which the mind is really no longer capable of direct thinking. It is no longer capable of truth-seeking in the real sense of the word. The term truth has come into bad times and has now been applied to so many different mistakes that it is practically impossible to classify them. But the fact seemingly remains that the mind, which might possibly have opened the doors to the internal, has only become another gatekeeper, preventing us from entering. The mind, therefore, guards the gate of the superior as a watchman to make sure that the individual does not outgrow the level of thinking which is common to his society. It is assumed that if he does this, he will be an outlaw, impoverished, and probably disgraced. So the mind guards his outer reputation at the expense of his inner life. Now, with this problem more or less obvious, what have we left as ways of finding the inner? Well, the second way, perhaps, is religion, as expressed through the heart doctrines of many people. Most people who will follow the heart doctrine, basically, are not intellectuals primarily. They may have excellent minds, they may know everything that a true intellectual does know, but they also have something else. They have a dimension of sympathy, a dimension of compassion, and they also have a deep-rooted belief and feeling that somewhere in the great pattern of things, an infinite love is moving the universe. These emotional-centered people, therefore, very often come closer to the reality than the intellectual. In emotion, you have experiences, sometimes disillusionments, sometimes discouragements, sometimes destructive reactions, hatreds, and so on. But basically, the heart doctrine is one based upon the teachings of Jesus or one of the other great benevolent world teachers. It is based on the assumption that the search for the reality of things is the primary purpose of human beings, and to live together in a fraternity based upon the realization of reality is the solution to the social dilemma. So the heart doctrine has had many exponents, and many of them have had, I think, a greater benevolent influence on mankind than almost any other level of instruction. The person who is in friendship and in love and affection some way seems to live on, and live on in the virtues and achievements of himself through his descendants. It is therefore a very important point to make sure that we realize the tremendous significance of religious affections. But now comes the rub. The religious reflections run into controversy. The individual wishing to be a devout person may find that devotion today is strangely altered, that the simple affair of doing good, of being kind, of being unselfish, these things are no longer really available in terms of affection. The individual has been cheated too often, he has been imposed upon, and he has also developed ulterior motives within himself that are so powerful that he is really incapable of a pure emotion. He cannot prevent his emotions by being colored or he cannot reconcile the inconsistency between a noble emotion and an ignoble action. So both exist together in the same person, and this conflict results in a loss of man's affection as a means of liberation. Now, another type of thing, we go down to a lower problem again, but one that's very distinctive, and that is social relationships. The humanitarian, the individual who lives to help the underprivileged, the benevolent person, the person who devotes his life to the service of mankind in one kind of way or another, the devout physician, the devout attorney, the devout industrialist, the individual who basically is unselfish, becomes a servant to physical needs of human beings, and also becomes an inspiration to their internal requirements. These all constitute a level of virtue in which the person becomes virtuous through service. And service is, of course, in fact, and in vision and in substance, the noblest expression of man's inner life. But the inner life itself must still be considered. We must try to find out what happens to help the individual to have an inward experience that is great enough to dominate his mental, emotional, and physical attributes, and in that way give him back to the leadership of the best of himself. Plato said that a country is best ruled when the best persons rule. The human being is best governed when the best part of himself leads. Now, some think the mind is the best part, others the emotions, some the physical body itself with its resources. But all of these finally come under the leadership of that which dwells within the body, within the emotions, behind the mind. What is this basis of reality? How are we going to reach it? How are we going to challenge it to come out of its strange aloofness so that it can become available to the person? One thing we find out immediately is that this search has to be personal. There is no possibility of communicating this reality in ways necessary to solve the problem of the individual, except that it be given to the individual with his particular problem. So we have to try to find out how to reach the opening of the inner life so that something superior to mind can become the ruler of mind, and use the mind, the emotions, and the body as an instrument for the fulfillment of a sacred purpose. This we have to try to discover in one way or another. We begin with it, and we begin to see that in ancient times there were various doctrines that were developed very largely for the purpose of bringing the individual into contact with his own higher nature. That there were teachings that taught him to rise above even the highest aspects of his own mind into an immediate and intimate experience of reality. This became a very deep and important problem, particularly with the Neoplatonists and with the Buddhists and several other groups, that the quest for the way to become enlightened. Enlightenment being, in this case, the light of the inner shining upon the outer. It was not the individual holding a candle up before his own mind. It had to be something else. The light had to be something that came from above and not through him as a person. It had to be a blessing, a benediction, a baptism of the Spirit. And he had to try to find if there was any way in the world in which it could happen to him. And most of those who have achieved greatly believe that it could happen.